The cliché that a week is a long time in politics has never been more apt, as Theresa May first appeared to be on the brink of collapse and then claimed victory with a deal to allow Brexit talks to move on to the next phase. Deal or no deal? The question that took Theresa May to Brussels not once but twice this week. On Monday it seemed it was all sorted. Time to move on to talks about trade. Then in stepped Arlene Foster.
Northern Ireland must leave the European Union on the same terms as the rest of the United Kingdom.
So lunch was left to go cold in Brussels as the PM rushed home to try and save her deal. The problem ran along the Irish border. Did promises of regulatory alignment mean Northern Ireland would operate differently from the rest of the UK? Unionist alarm bells could be heard in Westminster, where Theresa May relies on their support, while others saw their chance to tailor their own bespoke Brexit deal. So back to the drawing board and a chance for Labour to stick the boot in.
What an embarrassment. The last 24 hours have given a new meaning to the phrase coalition of chaos.
There was a tricky moment for the Brexit Secretary as he was quizzed over his economic impact studies that don't actually exist.
So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector?
On the
automotive sector?
No, not I'm aware of. No.
Is there one on aerospace?
No, I'm aware of.
No. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them, right.
While the Chancellor admitted the Cabinet has not yet debated future European trading relations.
Well, the Cabinet has had general discussions about our Brexit negotiations, but we haven't had a specific mandating of an end state position.
At Prime Minister's questions, Brexiteers reminded the PM they too had lines they wouldn't cross.
Will she apply a new coat of paint to her red lines? Because I fear on Monday they were beginning to look a little bit pink.
Talks through the night on Thursday and finally, white smoke. Tweeted by Jean-Claude Juncker's Chief of Staff to signal a deal had been done. 4 a.m. Friday, the red eye back to Brussels. The Brexit Secretary's face told the story of a long night. A tweak of the words and a deal agreed.
Sufficient progress has now been made on the strict terms of the divorce.
Not everyone was happy.
There are still matters there that we would have liked to see clarified.
I mean, the whole thing's a humiliation.
In a letter yesterday, Environment Secretary Michael Gove said voters could change the deal if they don't like it at the next general election. So let's unpack a week of remarkable political developments with our expert panel. And I'll start with you, Tim, if I would. If you look at the papers today, they're proclaiming a marvellous victory for Theresa May on Friday. But this was really a problem of her own making that she managed to dig herself out of.
Well, if you go back to when Theresa May was trying to do a deal with the DUP around the general election time, the government announced immediately they'd got one, and it took them 2.5 more weeks to nail it down. And it would have been worthwhile remembering that when she went off to Brussels and went into lunch with Jean-Claude Juncker, who'd said, don't come here unless you're ready to go. And then Theresa May basically had to kick Juncker out of his own office for an hour while she begged Arlene Foster to get into line. And initially, at that point, it wasn't happening because they simply hadn't nailed it down. And you're talking to James Brokenshire later. People say, you know, why weren't all these civil servants and people who know about how to deal with these guys engaged in this process? And there's the separation between the Northern Ireland office and Downing Street. The Whip's office were, frankly, negligent. They should have been sitting there holding hands with the DUP until the whole thing was put over the line. It was, you know, disaster was only narrowly averted. There were Tory MPs in the week who were saying, you know, this is now a catastrophe and Theresa May needs to go. And, you know, by hook or by crook, she pulled it out in the end.
Because in the middle of the week, Helen, we were talking about leadership plots and the possibility that Theresa May might lose her job over this, and now suddenly it looks like it's a victory.
Well, I think those will come back again, right? I think you have to try and divorce, when you're talking about all of this, the theatre that kind of happens around it and the last-minute concession and all this kind of stuff, which is not going to end at all. The question is what happens when the fudge recedes. I think that's the point at the moment. Everybody's got something they wanted out of this deal because there is no clarity. You saw Arlene Foster there saying, well, actually, what we want to hear is clarity. I think probably both sides, when they get that clarity, will be unhappy. And the question is, how unhappy and what are they going to do about it?
Because what's amazing at the moment, Toby, is that you have people on both sides of the Brexit debate within the Tory party proclaiming that they're very, very happy with this. They can't all be happy with it, can they?
Well, I'm not that surprised that the Brexiters seem to be reasonably content, in spite of the inclusion of that phrase full alignment that we'll go on to discuss in a minute. I mean, there are various things which the Remainers predicted couldn't be achieved. So the Remainers thought there'd be a massive backbench rebellion from the Eurosceptics about agreeing the divorce bill. Looks like that's just going to sail through. A lot of the Remainers thought that the status of EU nationals in the UK would remain uncertain for a prolonged period of time. It looks like that issue has more or less been resolved. But most importantly, because Theresa May's managed to get to the second phase, it makes a no-deal Brexit less likely. And that was always, I think, the Remainers' best hope of reversing the result of the referendum.
And so what we're left with is the question of the day is what on earth does full alignment mean? And David Davis was asked that when he was speaking on the Andrew Marr show a little earlier this morning.
Full alignment means outcomes. It means, you know, I mean, let's...
If I align two cars, they're next to each other.
Yeah. Well, Northern Ireland is next to the Republic of Ireland.
And it will have next to regulations. It'll be very similar.
You know, there will be some similarities. I mean, again, the Prime Minister laid this out in her Florence speech. She said there are areas where we will want similar outcomes, and we'll have similar methods to achieve them. There'll be areas where we have similar outcomes, we'll have different methods to achieve them. That's going to be true of a lot of product areas, a lot of manufacturing and so on. And there'll be areas where we want different outcomes and use different methods.
Well,
so that was clear as mud, or clear as fudge. Toby, what do you think full alignment means?
Well, I'm not sure we should be spending as much time as you seem to want to discussing it, because, as Michael Gove clarified on Friday, it doesn't have any legal force. I mean, it has some political purchase, but it doesn't have any binding legal force. I mean, it hasn't even yet got to the stage of a treaty. It might be difficult to unwind because it's the basis of an agreement, but nonetheless, it's not binding, and I think a lot remains to play for.
It is what got the DUP on board, though, isn't it? Finding a form of words which could mean what you wanted it to.
Well, look, you know, the whole story of the referendum is essentially people wanting immigration cut without the economy taking a hit, and that's the case that was made. And there's a similar version of what's happening with the DUP. You know, they want to stay very closely unionist party, aligned to Britain, but also they don't want their agriculture, you know, Northern Ireland's one of the biggest industries, to take a massive hit from that very hard border. So what you're trying to do is reconcile two contradictory impulses. And I disagree with Toby to the extent that I do think it really matters. That Philip Hammond clip is extraordinarily saying that the Cabinet have not discussed where they think this ends up in the end. That's where the big row will be.
And even Number 10 are specifically briefing that full alignment is deliberately vague. So we haven't really solved anything here, have we?
It's like one of those irregular verbs, you know, you converge, he doesn't diverge, I am in full alignment. And it's just, you know, constructive ambiguity has worked the Labour Party very well over the last 6 months. They've managed to get through a general election where they had, you know, half their supporters very hardline on one side and half on the other. And now the government is discovering the benefits of that. And, you know, this may well help them keep the show on the road.
OK, well